My grandmother has been severely ill my whole life. She has smoked cigarettes for over 50 years and is still a heavy smoker. She was diagnosed with a bad case of COPD at a fairly young age, before I was even born, but she never stopped smoking. I am a 20-year-old man now, and my grandma is still alive, even though she has suffered multiple heart attacks and strokes, and even been diagnosed with coronary artery disease and lung cancer. I remember my mum explaining to me that grandma is very sick and will die soon when I was just a little kid. All my life, she's been either sitting in a wheelchair, or on the couch, nor walking extremely slowly with a rollator. Only time she stands up during the day are the moments when she goes to the balcony for a cigarette, or needs to use the bathroom. In both of these situations, she almost always needs some help from my grandfather too. She's often very grumpy, and you rarely see her smiling. I've always liked to think that she's grumpy and annoyed only because of her illness, and I've never saw her as a mean or bad person. She had a habit of giving me and my siblings some pocket money every Friday, on the condition that we had acted right and fulfilled our responsibilities, like school and housework. We lived only a mile away from our grandparents, and my school was right next to their house. I could even see into their backyard on break time, and sometimes my grandfather would be there doing some yard work and waving at me. I normally went on to pick up my weekly pocket money right after school on Fridays, and the typical meeting was very quick and quiet. I knocked on the door and waited for my grandpa to come and slowly open the door. He always opened it just a little bit, softly said hello, and pushed his hand through the door gap. I took the money, thanked him, and at that point, the door was already almost closed. Usually the visit was just that short, but sometimes Grandma wanted to come and see me quickly and walked very slowly to the door with her rollator. I remember the typical situations where I only met Grandpa at the door and tried to view Grandma through the little gap that was open. It always looked dark, shadowy, and quiet inside, and I thought Grandma was probably taking a nap. I liked the tradition of getting to meet my grandparents every Friday, and it was always a nice start to my weekend. But then, one Friday afternoon, when I was about 13 or 14 years old and going to pick up my pocket money, something very weird happened, and that sight still gives me chills and deep anxiety. It was a sunny autumn day, and I got out of school a bit earlier than usual. I took my bicycle out of the bike stand and headed to my grandparents' house. Like I said, it was a little earlier than usual, so they weren't ready for me yet. I went on to knock on the door, but no one came to open it. I waited for a moment, but still no one came. I was about to leave and thought no one was home, until I heard some noises from the inside. I thought they just didn't hear my first couple of knocks, and knocked again, a bit harder than last time. It still took a while, but finally the door opened, even less than normally. It was dark. I could only see the fuzzy figure of my grandpa, who didn't even say hello this time. He just gave me the money and whispered that Grandma was sleeping, because they were not expecting me to be here yet. At this point, the door gap was a bit bigger, so I could see into the living room where there was some kind of dim light. I was a little ashamed about my sudden visit and decided to whisper back that I was sorry and my school had just ended earlier today. Before I could say anything. I heard intensifying footsteps coming out of the living room, and immediately after, saw my grandmother running through the living room in a weird, creepy, and unnatural looking forward bent posture, not moving her arms at all. I looked there for probably half a second, but I was so terrified, it felt like a minute. Grandpa just slammed the door shut in front of my face, and I stayed behind the door, almost shaking from the fear and shock. So many thoughts in my head. How can Grandma move so fast? She is very ill and can't even walk without support. Why did Grandpa lie about her nap? And what the hell was that? As I started to walk away to get my bike and leave, I calmed down and thought that maybe she wasn't moving that fast, or Mum has exaggerated her bad condition. I didn't even really believe these explanations. I just had to get some sort of logical reason to calm down. I walked over the grass to get my bike that was parked right under my grandparents' bedroom. I hopped on it and took a quick look on the window that was right next to my face. What I saw next still haunts me, and even after all these years, I find it hard to think and explain. My grandma, staring straight at me, with big, wide-open eyes and a deranged smile. She didn't even look like my grandma. Or she did, but the expression was something that my grandma would never do with her face. She looked similar to the Momo face that roamed the internet a couple of years ago. She seemed to be sitting or squatting on the floor, because her face was on the lower edge of the window. I was instantly terrified by the thought of her being there, stalking me with that disturbing face, while I stood there, calming down, and was slowly starting to leave. I remember hiding my fear and responding to her stare with a little smile, but she didn't react at all. Then, my grandpa ran behind her and closed the curtains. I cycled home, fast, and told my mum the whole story, which she basically just ignored, thinking I over-exaggerated her speed. She couldn't understand why I was scared of her looking at me from the window. But she wasn't there. My grandma was not looking at me. She was stalking at me. After that day, I didn't go to get my pocket money for weeks. As time passed, I started to go visit them. At first with my mother, and later alone again. Grandma was always like I remembered. She can't even walk without support. No one ever mentioned anything about that day, and my grandparents were asking why I suddenly stopped visiting on Fridays. I know my grandpa remembers that, but I've always been too scared to ask. I kinda just want to forget the whole thing and spend as much time with my grandparents as possible. But I'll never forget that day. My terminally ill grandmother ran like a child and stalked me through the window like a psychopath. What was that? Pigpen Ben. He raises pigs, breeds pigs, sells pigs, butchers pigs, eats pigs, even sleeps with pigs. Pigpen Ben is what we like to call a hamsexual. Or maybe that's just what I call him. He's got a lot of land. Well, his family does. and he's on it. Been on it for 40 years. Won't leave. Too many pigs. His dilapidated matchbox of a house is a good ways down his muddy driveway. I don't know why it's muddy all the time, since it doesn't rain enough for it to stay so wet. But nonetheless, I don't recommend going down there in a car. You'll get stuck. Then you'll have to hear the squealing. Not from the pigs. Ben's. The man is blessed in the head. That one don't just come from me, either. We all say it around here. I don't suppose a doctor has ever certified him insane or lacking chromosomes or whatever we call it these days, but there's no denying that he's a few fries short of a Happy Meal. Ain't nothing wrong with that, of course, unless we're talking about general well-being. Anyways, the man crawls around like he's a pig, eats from the trough, rolls around in the mud, snorts and squeals. And did I mention pork's the pork? Gross, right? That's why I don't eat any of the meat from his farm. You can cook off a lot of nastiness, but at the end of the day, that's still sodomized bacon. I make a habit of not going to Ben's. Hell, I even speed up when I drive by. Not just because of the stories, but the smell, too. Pig shit. A pig corpse. And something sweet on top of it all. Peaches, I think. Pig, poop, and peaches. I'd planned on never setting foot in that god-forsaken property. But then one day, my dad told me, "Go on down to Ben's and pick up the pig Juan purchased." Juan is a Mexican fella that works for my dad. Hard worker, good guy, but don't know shit about Pigpen Ben. So I felt the need to enlighten him. I turned to Juan, who was standing next to my dad, looking mighty grateful for something I hadn't even agreed to do yet, and said, "Juan, them pigs been defiled." Juan cocked his head, because, of course, defiled ain't in his vocabulary, and asked, "You get pig?" "No, Juan, I won't get pig." Fucker looked heartbroken, turned to my dad for confirmation, to which my dad looked back at me and barked, "Yes, you are getting the pig." "But, Dad..." "I don't care what stories you heard about old Ben. Juan wants to treat the guys to a pig roast." "Why didn't he just bring the pig with him after he bought it?" "He gave the money to Lyle over at the bar last night." Lyle. That's Ben's brother. He don't live on the farm. He got himself a little trailer down a ways, but still stops by the farm periodically to bring his brother groceries and whatnot. Lyle's a real shit show himself, but he ain't as bad as Ben, so most people prefer to go to him whenever they want a pig. I sighed. "So, does that mean Lyle will meet me there?" Dad nodded. "Him and Juan arranged to meet in an hour." "I don't see why Juan can't get the pig himself." "We got work to do." I sighed again. "Fine. I'll go get the damn pig." My red Chevy pickup travelled down the muddy driveway with ease, and I realised, had I owned a car instead, I wouldn't have been stuck with the task. I was immediately nauseous from the smell, even with the windows rolled up. Parked over by the house was Lyle's rusted old tin can of a truck, putting in some of my worries to rest. I pulled up beside it and put my truck in park, then sat inside with it running. Lyle wasn't anywhere in sight. "Damn it," I muttered. "Where the hell is he?" After waiting several more moments without seeing him, I shut off the truck and climbed out. My boots hit the mud with a splatter and sunk about an inch. The smell was even more overwhelming outside. I hesitantly took several sucking steps towards where the pigs were fenced in and watched them chowing madly from the trough like they hadn't eaten in a week. Snorting and slurping, whatever the pigs were eating. It sounded wet, and those sorts of noises, accompanied by the god-awful smells that permeated through the farm, made for a truly disgusting experience. But these pigs were frantic. like drug addicts getting their fix. I had to know what they were eating. So I walked around the fence to the other side of the trough and looked in. It was difficult to see past all the big porker heads, but I managed to catch a glimpse of what looked like ground beef. I grimaced. I know pigs will eat just about anything, but it's still unsettling to watch them eat meat. I walked along the fence, looking at the different pigs. Pink, black and white, brown. Most were hefty swine. Fat as fuck, I'd say. But as I walked along, staring at their large, muddy backs, I saw one that looked strange. In spots where there wasn't mud, I could see that its skin looked different from the others. It wasn't hairy, and it wasn't pink. More like a suntanned colour. And its back arched in a strange way, more hunched, and with back muscles flexing as it ate. I leaned against the fence for a closer look. And then I realised what was so odd about this particular pig. It wasn't a pig at all. "Oh, fuck!" I gasped. Immediately, Ben looked up and made eye contact with me. Raw, bloody meat hanging from his teeth, dripping down his neck. In the trough, laying atop the ground-up gore, was an eyeball, and clumps of hair, and a human toe. Ben squealed as I stumbled backward, slipping in the mud, and fell to my ass. He squealed again, then snorted several times, getting louder with each. I kicked along the ground and staggered back to my feet, and as I did so, Ben had leaped over the fence and was chasing after me. No longer on all fours like a pig, but moving like a man instead. "Ben, stop!" I cried, as I slipped along the mud back towards the truck, my boots coming off my feet in the process. He hit me from behind and tackled me to the ground, then shoved my face into the mud. He mounted onto my back, put his mouth to my ear, and began loudly squealing like a pig. I flailed wildly, kicking the ground and elbowing Ben on the ribs, all to no success. I became worried that was it. That's how I was going to die. Face down in the mud, with Pigpen Ben making barnyard noises in my ear. I was just about done in, when, all of a sudden, he pulled me up by the hair, dismounted me, and plopped me back down on the mud. I quickly rolled over, and flung clumps of mud from my mouth and nose, then lay there gasping. I wiped mud from my eyes and looked up to see Ben standing over me. "Daisy don't want you to die," he added, then looked over at a large female pig, who stood at the fence, staring at me. Her snout and mouth were covered with blood and chunks of meat. "She didn't like Lyle, though. Lyle tried to sell her." I didn't say a word. I crawled over to my truck, pulled myself up, flung myself inside, and fumbled with the keys. I finally got the truck started and hurried the hell out of there. Ben chewed as he watched me leave. Then, as I reached the end of the driveway, he returned to his pig pen. It's been a whole year since my girlfriend and I have been together. We met while we were both bartending at a local restaurant. She was working while going through a nursing program, whereas I was just going about my life day by day. Petite, with long red hair and covered in tattoos, she was as kind as she was feisty. We flirted a bit, the back and forth of awkward human courtship. Then one thing led to another, and we started dating. We had been dating for a little over a year, and we decided to get an apartment together. I didn't really have any goals, just trying to make it through life as comfortably as possible. I'll go to work, go home, eat, drink, just doing whatever I want as simply as possible. My girlfriend was driven, extremely determined to take down any goals and get whatever she wants. I think that's what kind of attracted me in the first place. She knew what she wanted in her life. I considered myself lucky that she wanted a deadbeat like me in the first place. I'm not sure what she saw in me, but she kept me moving forward. I was happy. We were happy. I'm not saying that everything was perfect. Of course, we had our ups and downs. As long as I did what she told me, things would cool off and would be back to normal. But it was last year when we just couldn't get out of a rough patch, and then the accident happened. We were driving back home from a long week of holiday festivities when we had gotten into a car accident. The roads were icy, and I wasn't paying attention. I just wasn't careful enough, and I completely totaled my car. I still remember that night. The air freezing, the blood that ran down my forehead, and looking over towards her to see if she was okay. We were both rushed to the hospital, and were there a whole week. Ever since the accident, she had completely changed. I can barely look her in the eye since the accident was all my fault. The car repairs, the hospital bills, and everything else just really took a toll on us. I'd lie in bed each night, hoping for her to forgive, but my apologies are answered with words of hate. So, I look up at the ceiling and just stare as she berates me for everything I've caused, my heart filling up with regret at the undeniable fact that I ruined her life. The other day marked a full year since the accident. I was sitting on the couch, going over the letter filled with hospital bills that needed to be paid as she sat on the floor in a corner across from me. Her eyes were bloodshot as she gazed towards my direction. Her stare was burning a hole through me. Usually, she would spend the time cursing me, but she was dead quiet. The silence was absolutely deafening. I couldn't take it anymore, so I grabbed my keys and rushed outside to my car. I rested my head on top of the steering wheel. The air was chilling my skin, just like that night. I took a deep breath and turned to the passenger seat. She was so silent as she sat there, a stoic look upon her gaunt face, while her eyes were fixed forward. I told her again that I was sorry, weak words that piled upon the other countless apologies. I wanted so badly to give it all back, all the time she had lost, and the life she was supposed to have. Let's just go. She finally spoke. Her voice was so hoarse, and it was grating in my ears. I put my key into the ignition and cranked my Honda Civic to life. We didn't have anywhere to go, but I obeyed her request. We drove aimlessly for about 20 minutes or so. Every now and then, she would point a long, thin finger towards a direction to go. I took another deep breath and finally worked up the nerve to ask, "What are we doing?" My chest suddenly ached as the words escaped my lips. She was silent, her face completely emotionless, as she continued to stare forward, unblinking. I had no idea where we were. We were surrounded by nothing but darkness. I cursed myself at how pathetic I was to listen to her commands, but I felt so compelled to listen to her every word. A faint light could be seen from the distance. As we drove closer, our stretch of road had entered the mouth of a large tunnel. I slowed my car to a stop in front of the gaping entrance to the tunnel. Looking inside, all I could see were dim lights that slowly flickered on and off. I didn't even know we had a road that led here. I looked over towards her again, to see that she had turned her head to face me. And all I could see was a dark outline of a once familiar body. Her voice emerged from the shadows. "Go forward." I didn't want to go. I'm not sure why, but an overwhelming feeling of dread began to wash over me. Then, the inside of my chest started to thump wildly, causing my ribs to ache. The pain was immense, but as soon as I gripped my shaky hands onto the steering wheel, the aching slowly subsided. I pressed my foot onto the gas pedal, and we proceeded to move forward. We drove into the tunnel. The orange lights were slowly flickering around us. The strobing glow caused my vision to disorient. I was at a loss at how long we were driving. 20, 40 minutes, and there was no end in sight. The sound of her breath filled the space around me in short, raspy bursts. I was going to ask her what was going on until she cut me off. "All your fault." Each word slammed my chest like a sledgehammer. There isn't a moment that goes by that I don't think of that. I tried to make her happy, but everything I did was never enough. I felt cursed. I thought things would be okay as long as I did as she told me. I was constantly walking on thin ice around her, with each step causing spider-webbed cracks in our relationship. She continued to speak. "Give it back." Her voice echoed throughout the car. No, the entire tunnel. I glanced towards the passenger seat to see that she was gone. She had completely vanished, and I wasn't sure what to feel. Relief from her absence or complete terror in the lack of her presence. I switched my foot to the brake pedal, and the car began to slow down. The speed began to lower, and as it did, the inside of my chest began to burn. It was as if something was digging through the muscle and tissue inside my chest and tightly squeezing my ribs. The lights around me began to flicker from a dim orange glow to a solid dark red light. I let out a scream. My chest felt like it was stretching, so I stepped on the gas again. As the speed went up, the pain doled out. I'm sorry, please, I'm so fucking sorry," I yelled towards the abyss in the tunnel. I gripped tighter to the steering wheel to stop my hands from shaking. I didn't dare slow the car down again. The recent memory of the pain was so intense, I didn't want to feel that again. That's when I had passed something. Still, a dark silhouette, even in this evil red light I can recognize her. I passed her again, and again, and again. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't escape her, and I don't believe I would escape that place. I felt my mind break, and I pushed my foot all the way onto the gas pedal. Faster and faster my car began to speed on this dark stretch of road. To the left of me I could see her, standing against the well of the tunnel. I'd pass her again and again. No matter how fast I drove and how many miles had passed, she would still stay to the left of me. The memories began to rush inside of my head, and as I looked forward, I could see them play out before me. We've been together for a whole year, ever since the accident. I've seen her in every corner of the apartment that was once ours, staring at me amongst a group of strangers and creeping behind me. It was all my fault that I couldn't save her, that I couldn't do enough for her. Last year, that long year ago, we had nothing but bad things going on. She was struggling with the stress of work and nursing school, and I tried my best to make ends meet. I had picked up extra shifts at work, gotten a new job, and I've done all I could to take care of her, but it was never enough. I thought that seeing our families would make things just a little bit better, a relief from the stress that she had accumulated. Unfortunately, that made things worse. The entire time we had argued, she told me that she hated me. I was never enough for her. She said that she tried to fix me, but I didn't ask for that. She said she hated taking care of me, but I didn't necessarily want that either. I wanted us to be happy, together. I wanted for us to stand side by side with each other. The roads were so icy, and we were so damn close to our home. I told her that I loved her, and she sat there with an emotionless face staring forward. Let me out. She demanded, but I refused. It was freezing outside, and I refused to let her walk home. I'm tired of you, she shouted at me. I was taken aback. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You've ruined my life. Give it back. Give me back the time I wasted on you. She grabbed the wheel and began to turn it wildly. I begged for her to stop, but my words fell upon deaf ears. I cried. This was all my fault. She wouldn't feel this way if it weren't for me being such a shit person. I let go of the steering wheel, and she pulled a sharp turn towards the woods. Our bodies jumped out at the uneven landscape beneath my car, and I felt us lift upwards and turn. The next thing I heard was a loud, high-pitched scream and the crunching of metal. I wasn't sure how long we had been out there. I remember feeling a burn on my face from the blood being chilled by the winter air. My body ached, and I looked down to see a large amount of blood dripping from me as a portion of the front car had crushed my chest. I couldn't breathe, and I was sure that I would die soon. I looked towards her, my girlfriend, to see her glaring at me with bloodshot eyes, and her throat completely crushed. Tears ran down her face as she began to mouth something. Those silent words were the loudest things I've ever heard. I hate you. Miraculously, a man had saw the whole thing happen as he drove a distance behind us. He'd immediately come to rescue us, then saw the state that we were in. He called 911, and not too long after, we were freed and sent to a hospital. My girlfriend, she didn't make it. But me, well, the damage to my chest was bad. My ribs were crushed, and bones had pierced my heart. Luckily, my girlfriend not only was a donor, she was a perfect match for me. Believe it or not, we were able to transfer her heart into me. The memories blurred with my tears and eventually faded away. I was snapped back to reality when I noticed that I was still speeding through the hellish tunnel. I looked over to see her, but she had vanished again, until my chest began to burn and expand again. Give it back. Give me back my life. Her voice was so forced and raspy, but it was loud and clear despite her crushed throat. You've taken everything from me. I let out a cry as I felt something burst through my chest. I looked to see her frail hands coming out of me. Then her bloodied fingers began to wrap around my mouth to stifle my screaming. I couldn't take it anymore. I lost control of my car, and I saw that her other bloodied hand grabbed the wheel and turned it towards the wall of the tunnel. It was like deja vu. When I awoke, I was inside the debris of my crashed car. I was feeling such intense pain, I wished I was still unconscious. I heard something squish and squelch, and I looked at my chest to see, inside of my open chest, her face staring at me with those burning red eyes. I heard snapping from within me, and I could see her showing me something. Pieces of bone that must have been my ribs. She lifted the pieces up to her mouth, and she began to grind them inside her mouth. I arched my back and writhed in agony. I felt pain, sadness, anger with myself. This all happened because of me. If only I was better, was the only thing that reverberated inside of my mind. I felt something else move within me. She began to wriggle her way within me through my arms and legs. At that moment, I wanted to die. I wanted it to end. But I know that she was punishing me. making sure that I would feel as much pain as possible. At the very least, I prayed to lose consciousness again. And sure enough, even though I didn't deserve it, my wish was granted. I awoke in a hospital bed, with a nurse and doctor examining me. They told me a story that they had found my vehicle crashed on the side of the road near my apartment, and that the ambulance was immediately on the scene. I came out okay, despite some breaks in my ribs, along with some broken bones in my ribs. The doctor said that I was lucky to be alive, and that I'll be okay. The words were muffled as I stared behind him to find her staring right back at me. So, here I am, alive and well, with her right beside me. I beg for her forgiveness, and she returns my apologies with scorn. I had taken everything from her, and it was all my fault that she had died. Now, I must live. A piece of shit like me, living with her beating heart inside of me, with a life that she should have had. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened. Not the hundreds of hours of classroom learning. All the practical training exercises in the world were for nothing. A squadron of fighter jets might have stood a chance, but I doubt it. I encountered an unstoppable force of nature 6 years ago. Like a tsunami or a volcano eruption. If you're caught in its path, you're dead. Lucky for me, I survived, and it was sheer luck that I did. This is a warning. Stay out of Yosemite National Park. 6 years ago, I was a mounted patrol ranger. On that day, Buckley, my horse, and I were out on patrol near Tuolumne Meadows, when I noticed a man approaching us in the distance. He waved his arms at us frantically and collapsed to the ground. He clutched his chest, struggling to catch his breath. His mouth was wide open as he gasped for air. I thought he might be having an asthma attack. I immediately noticed blood on his shirt as we came closer, but he didn't appear to be wounded. He cried out for help as I jumped off Buckley and went to see if there was anything I could do while I radioed for medical assistance. Before he could catch his breath, the man incoherently told me something about his son being injured and something about a tour group. I told him to concentrate on catching his breath so he could tell me what was happening clearly. Once he could speak, he introduced himself as Greg and told me what happened with his tour group. Honestly, I couldn't believe it until I experienced it for myself. He said they'd been on a guided tour in the woods nearby, and everything was fine until there was a series of explosions among the tour group. Greg said his son's cell phone had exploded in his pocket, and his wife's digital camera had blown to pieces inside the carrying case. Everyone's electronic devices had blown, including the tour guide's radio. He also mentioned that a man had collapsed on the spot and remained unresponsive. Of course, his main concern was for his son. He said shards from the phone were lodged in his leg, and he'd suffered serious burns. They tried to tend to the wounds before he came running for help. I relayed the information back to base, requesting medical assistance on my position once Greg led me back to the injured group. While I didn't like to ride double on Buckley, time was of the essence. Greg was far too exhausted to continue on foot. The tour group couldn't have been too far away anyway, if he'd made it to me. Buckley could handle the weight, and we needed to get there as soon as possible. He likely would have died of a heart attack if I didn't give him a ride. Perhaps that would have been a mercy compared to how he died later. We rode alongside the stream, heading directly for the tree line in the distance. The path was familiar, a popular destination for a moderate hike. Greg showed me where to go. As we came closer to the trees, I felt a rising warmth on my side. exactly where my radio was attached to my belt. Remembering what Greg had told me earlier about the electronics, I immediately reached down and removed the radio from my holster. It felt like it had been left out under the sun for hours. It was so damn hot. It burned the palm of my hand, and I dropped it to the side. Upon hitting the ground, it sparked before it exploded. Buckley got startled by the sound and bucked. I confronted him as best as I could while charging ahead. The further into the woods we went, Buckley became more agitated. He bucked hard, nearly tossing Greg and me off of him. It wasn't like Buckley to not follow commands. He'd been trained for service since he was a colt. The further I tried to force him to continue, the more he fought and fought, until I decided to leave him behind. Buckley fought like crazy when I tried to tie him to a tree. There wasn't much I could do against the horse if he was dead set on leaving. In a last-ditch effort, I tried to pull him, and the rein slipped from my hand. Buckley turned back in the direction we'd come from and disappeared into the woods. He'd run back to the stable like he was trained to do. Admittedly, this left me feeling shaken. As we trekked through the woods, Greg asked if I had any idea what was happening, and I didn't have an answer for him. Buckley getting spooked, I could understand. Something unnerved him. Greg and I couldn't sense it, but Buckley could feel it from the moment we entered those woods. Exploding electronics wasn't something we were taught about in training. As I said earlier, nothing in the world could have prepared me for what came that day. Nothing. When I made myself known, I was immediately ambushed by several tourists. They all spoke at once, requesting help for their loved ones. Being swarmed by everyone asking questions and pleading for assistance did not help the situation. Most of the injured sustained burns and lacerations, from what I could see. What really worried me, though, was the unresponsive man Greg mentioned earlier. Through the crowd, I saw a woman sitting off to the side, with a 1,000-yard stare in her eyes. She sat against a tree, alone, next to a heavy-set man, face down on the ground. I insisted on attending to the man, who clearly wasn't moving or showing any signs of life. From what I could tell, he wasn't even breathing. I ran over to the man and checked for a pulse while asking his companion if she felt okay. She didn't respond, and I could see why. There was no pulse. The man was dead. Falling back on my training, I immediately went to start chest compressions. I reached underneath the man's side to flip him over, and my hands were immediately met with warmth and wetness. When I turned him over, I immediately jumped in surprise. My hands were covered in blood. The entire left side of the man's upper body was missing. Pieces of wire and metal surrounded the mangled meat of the wound. At the confirmation that her companion was indeed dead, the woman wailed so loudly that everyone turned their attention to her. She said only one word between her sobs and screams, which I understood. Pacemaker. Seeing a casualty, I called out for someone to hand me something to cover the deceased face. No one moved or made a noise, aside from the woman grieving her dead companion. It was here I noticed the absolute silence surrounding us. Usually there are signs of life all around us, making noises. Birds chirping, bugs buzzing, frogs croaking. I realized we were in much more danger than we knew. It was silent around us because the animals had either run away, as Buckley had, or they remained quiet to hide from what scared them. Whatever was happening, I needed to get everyone out of the woods quickly. I commanded the non-injured to assist the wounded and help them start walking out of the woods. One of the women in the group immediately asked why I didn't just radio for help. I told her my radio had blown and we needed to get out of there as soon as possible. If you've ever done anything in life with a group of people, you'll understand that getting them to follow directions is damn near impossible. One person wants to fight back on anything you tell them because they don't respect authority. Another person yells at that person to comply. Those two start a fight. You have another person who starts doing their own thing. You have others following them. Groups split off into other groups and do whatever they want. In this case, we didn't even get the chance to start fighting each other. As I tried to get everyone moving, a blast of lightning ripped across a blackening sky above us. It struck a tree only a few hundred yards away. Then the wind picked up, lifting leaves and dust and debris through the air. The weather report for the week was clear, sunny skies with no chance of precipitation. This development had unnerved me as I looked up to the clouds overhead and saw how deeply dark and ominous and out of place these alien clouds were in the sky. Buried somewhere within the primitive part of my brain, I recognized something was amiss in the isolated pocket of our world. It must have hit the others in the group as well, as some of them stopped and stared into the sky, petrified and frozen in place, awaiting their demise. Others rushed to grab their loved ones and drag them to safety. Still, others abandoned the group in utter terror, with nothing but the instinct of self-preservation dominating the otherwise civilized and evolved parts of their being. What comes next? I still see it whenever it storms. First, another eruption of lightning tore the sky asunder, nearly deafening me with its turbulent force. Then, in the electrical firebolt streaking across the sky, I saw the silhouette of a massive winged creature flying through the air. Each thrust of its colossal wings produced bolts of lightning crackling across the sky in all directions. I was glued to the spot, staring up at it through the tops of trees and branches in awe. As the creature circled the sky above, with each flash and crackle of lightning, the sky filled with smaller versions of the beast, surrounding their brood mother. This is what had spooked Buckley and all the other animals. They knew this creature was coming and ran for their lives. Our exploding electronics were our warning. Nothing as deep-seated as animal instinct, but a warning nonetheless. After witnessing this, I am ashamed to admit that I gave in to the part of me hell-bent on self-preservation and started to run away from the woods. But unfortunately, many others had already run away, leaving behind those who tried to help their injured friends and family. If I had tried to help anyone, I would have likely joined them in death. As I ran into the woods, I saw someone running in front of me, rise into the air as if the invisible hand of God plucked them from the ground. There wasn't any time to process what I'd seen when I felt a sudden lurch beneath my feet, and then I too was airborne. My first crazed thought was to assume one of those creatures had swept me off the ground. However, as the world spun, I realized nothing held on to me. Instinctively, I reached out and tried to take hold of a tree branch, but I couldn't get a grasp as they slipped through my hands, and I went further into the air. This happened at least a dozen more times, until I finally grabbed hold tightly to a branch and managed to pull myself to the trunk. I still felt the force of being pulled upward as I held on and didn't let go until the whole thing was over and the creatures were gone. But I'm jumping ahead there. From my position, I had a clear view of what was happening. The others hadn't been as lucky as I was. They continued to float into the air, spinning around, screaming, and reaching out like a doomed astronaut, untethered and floating into the vastness of outer space. It wasn't only the people, either. There were deer, birds, and several other animals caught in the same trap. All of them floated through the air, high above the trees, and stopped their heavenly ascent at the same point. With one final screech from the brood mother, the smaller creatures circled through the air and then swooped down to enjoy their meal. Humans, animals, insects, whatever managed to float to that invisible line in the sky was consumed. The sound of their screeches and squawks masked the screams. I turned my head away, holding it against the tree and tightening my grip on the tree trunk for dear life. I didn't know if these creatures would notice one of their snacks had gone missing. Maybe they'd sweep down into the trees and I'd be done for. But of course, they didn't. I cannot guess how long I stayed in the tree, but once the screeches and squawks stopped, I no longer heard any screams, and gravity felt as if it had returned. and I braved a look into the sky. It was clear of any monsters or dark, calamitous clouds. Nothing or no one floated into the air against the laws of gravity. The setting sun of dusk returned to its rightful place, dominating the sky and extinguishing the last remains of light in the day. All had returned to normal, except for my state of mind. I climbed down the tree, slowly and steadily, as my muscles ached. Once I reached the ground, I sat down and allowed myself to rest. My mind was reeling, my body was thrashed. I closed my eyes for what felt like a minute or two, and awakened to a paramedic shaking me. Moments later, I was carted off in an ambulance and treated for wounds I'd sustained while climbing down from the tree. There were tons of questions as to what happened afterward. The whole incident was chalked up to a random freak tornado happening in that area, and the tour group was wiped out in the resulting storm. According to authorities on the scene, there were dark clouds over that section of the woods, and they saw a massive cone touch down. As far as I was concerned, I let them tell whatever story they wanted to make it all go away. It's not like anyone would believe me anyway. Not long after the incident, I decided to quit being a park ranger and moved to Philadelphia to live with some family for a while before getting back on my feet again. I just couldn't stand the thought of being in the forest anymore, after seeing what I saw. So, when it storms, I run for cover indoors and stay away from windows. I drown myself in alcohol and take a few extra Xanax to avoid the inevitable thoughts that creep into my mind at night before going to sleep. But, in my nightmares, I'm always back to Yosemite. Buckley and I are on patrol, and we see Greg coming toward us, in need of help. Is there anyone here who's ever been to Fataville up north? I've been thinking about my hometown a lot recently, but I've been having a hard time finding others on the internet who've heard of the place. My grandkids tell me that you can find anything on the web, but clearly that's not the case. If you know anyone who's been to or is from Fataville, or you are yourself, please get in touch with me. I would love to reminisce about my hometown a little. Let me introduce myself. I'm Greg. I'm in my 60s now. I left Fataville when I was 22 for an office job that went nowhere. I never went back. I figured it might be good for me to tell you fine people some of the stuff that I remember, even if you don't believe me. At the very least, I hope you all find it interesting. If you'd like to hear more stories I remember from Fataville, please let me know. There's really so much to tell. Fataville was a nice place, and I'm not just saying that because I'm old and nostalgic. It had its share of troubles, but the streets were safe there. Our crime was low, our citizens fed, and we had the most wonderful parks. You could wander there for hours, entranced by the green. We let our gardens run wild, feral and flourishing, a merciless riot of colour, only being so bold as to tame them when they threatened to overtake the paths that allowed us to look at them safely. They never seemed to mind. Perhaps they liked the attention. I get ahead of myself. It was one of these gardens that I was wandering the night I broke one of the laws of Fataville for the first time. Or perhaps not for the first time. I did my share of running wild in my teens, same as everyone else. But everyone knew that someone who got caught smoking pot or the like would only spend the night in City Hall before being released, hapless and embarrassed, back to his parents. It was not one of the real laws. Not one of the ones told to children. Not one of the ones that counted. I can hardly remember them all these days, but I remember one clear as day. Be home before the sun sets. I remember when I was young, my parents took me to a movie and lost track of time, so that when we left the theatre, it was nearly night. the sky painted in flame. I remember the panicked looks on their faces, the way they hauled me by the arm to our car and broke the speed limits on the drive home, fleeing the night. I didn't understand why. You must understand, I was quite young, and this was before the internet. I had never spoken to someone outside Fataville. This was the way the world worked, and I never thought to question it. The closest I came was considering it parental overcaution as I reached my rebellious youth. I never once, until that night, thought to really question why. I scarcely remember why I was out so late. Some girl, I think. I was a silly pining youth, dreaming of bringing a pretty girl to the park full of beautiful flowers. I wouldn't have picked one for her. There were laws in Fataville, and that was one of them. But I wondered, silly and in what I thought was love. Silly enough to not notice how late it was getting, until I saw the length of the shadows around me. The phrase, "a chill ran down my spine," is overused, but more than that, insufficient. There was ice in my blood, but more than that, it was the vulnerability, the sense of trespass, the sudden rush of alertness as I realized that I was not safe. I was alone, surrounded by plants that cared nothing for me, and the sun was setting. I was alone, away from my girlfriend, my parents, away from anyone who cared about me, and the sun was setting. I had never stayed out after dark, and the sun was setting. The sun was setting, and I was afraid. I ran. Like I said, Fataville was a reasonable place. You couldn't stay out past dusk, but there was no reason you needed to be in your home. So the city constructed makeshift shelters, little more than glorified bus stations, places to hide from the oncoming night. Everyone knew about them. There was one on every street corner, one by the school, many by every park in the city, a place to hide everywhere you looked. They were barely enough to fit 2 or 3 people, but it was enough for me. It took me only a few minutes to reach the nearest shelter, but in that time, the shadows had lengthened. I could put no name to the fear that took me, as the sky shifted to purple and blue, the stars glittering like tiny eyes. I only knew, in my heart of hearts, the part of me that was still a child hearing my mother's stories, the part of me that was still a frightened mammal scurrying to the den, that I needed to be inside, even the poultry inside of a shelter. The shelters, despite the importance of them, were not that impressive. They looked more like outhouses, almost 4 flimsy walls and a door, and little else. But the door locked, and I remember the wave of relief that swept through me as I crashed inside and slammed the door behind me, hard enough to shake it before collapsing against it. I was safe. In the morning I could return to my parents and be cosseted and scolded and grounded, but alive. I even dared to mock myself for my terror. What could be the problem? Only children were afraid of the dark. This was Fataville, where it was safe. I should have just walked home. But I didn't leave the shelter. I had just settled myself on the hard cot, ready to wait out the night, when I heard the pound of footsteps. There was a judder as a body slammed against the door, someone losing control of their momentum in their panic. "Please," I heard a voice gasp. "Please, please. I know, but please." I didn't wait. Perhaps I should have. Perhaps I should have thought about it more. I've thought about it a lot over the years. I did not. I had the door open in an instant, and the person ducked inside, collapsing against the wall the same way I had. "Shut it!" they gasped. Shut it now! Hurry!" The lock slid home with a click, and I turned to them. "Are you hurt?" I didn't know what I could do about it if they were, but I thought I should ask. But they did not look hurt, only shaky and tired. They were tall and thin, with long, stick-straight dark hair. There was a little light in the shelter, only what filtered through the tiny windows, and it made their eyes look wide and dark and strange. They gave me a dubious look and struggled to their feet. "I'm fine," they said brusquely. They said nothing more, leaning against the wall with their arms crossed and staring out the window. I hesitated. "So, what are you running from?" They gave me a withering stare. "The night, obviously," they said, a voice dripping icy scorn. I snapped my mouth shut. I was jittery, fidgeting where I sat on the tiny cot. It seemed, I thought ruefully, that I was going to be spending the night with someone after all. The shelter had no clock. We waited there, silent for what seemed like hours, but could have been minutes. I scratched at a scab on my nails, wondering if braving the night and the dangers it theoretically contained would have been better than this. I was on the verge of falling asleep when I heard the scream. It was piercing, a ululating howl that rose in fearful crescendo, the sound of a woman in some terrible pain. I had already rose to my feet and was at the door before I consciously realized it, my hand on the doorknob, before the stranger in there grabbed me by the wrist. Their grip was strong, their skin cold, their long nails digging into my skin. "Don't," they hissed. I stared at them. "You crazy? There's—" "Shut up and listen." They dragged me away from the door. I was athletic, a broad, healthy young man, but they, whoever they were fearfully strong. I struggled, to no avail. "Listen." It was at that moment the scream came again. I hissed through my teeth, yanking against their vice-like hands on me, when something occurred to me. The eye of memory threw up a card, and then went and hid. It had been the same scream. The exact same scream. The same wailing, shrieking crescendo, like a recording played over again. I froze. Even my breath stopped in my chest. It came again. The same sound, like a recording. Or perhaps not the same sound. This time it sounded higher, cold like an Arctic wind. There was a faint distortion too, I realized. I didn't know how to describe it, only a subtle warping that I wouldn't have noticed had I not been so tense and fearful, my senses blown wide to the structure of the world. The stranger released me. I didn't open the door, instead stumbling backward to sink weakly onto the cot. Everything seemed so far away. I realized, distantly, that my hands were shaking. "What?" The stranger shrugged. They were tense too, I realized. There was a practiced air of nonchalance about them. But I saw the way they sent glances towards the door and windows, shifting their weight on their feet, as if preparing to run. "Haven't you," they said, "never heard of anglerfish?" I didn't ask what they meant. I didn't want to know. Perhaps it seems odd to you that I didn't question it or try to see for myself. I promise you, you would have not opened that door either. Few people could be curious enough to look in the face of that cold howl. The questions were for the sunlight and the comfort of your home. In the moment, all I did was swallow. Are we safe in here?" The walls, which had seemed flimsy but sufficient, suddenly seemed to be made of paper. The stranger looked at me again. They still did not seem friendly. Their eyes still wide and odd, but their face seemed to soften a little as they looked at me and took in how frightened I must have seemed. How out of my depth. "That's what these are for," they said. "As long as we don't open the door until sunrise, we'll be fine. All we have to do is wait." All we had to do was wait. I no longer tried to sleep. I felt like a caveman, keeping watch at the mouth of a cave, staring alone into the darkness. Every shift in the underbrush, the sign of a wolf or a tiger. I was hiding in a flimsy little shelter, my only companion an unknown quantity, without even knowing the benefit of a spear in my hand. It was this vigilance that made it so. When there was a shift of movement outside the window, I caught it. What? Shh! I closed my mouth immediately. Rude or not, the stranger clearly knew more about this than I did. Whatever was going on, and I had no idea what it could be, I was not willing to die for my pride. We stared at a tiny window. I was just about to write off the movement as a trick of a tired and frightened mind, when it came again. I froze, like a rabbit hiding from a fox. There was something outside the window. I couldn't see what it could be. All I could see was a shadow. There was something outside the window, but I could hear no footsteps. Only faint shadows behind the too thin glass. I was still, except for my breath, which came fast and rough. I couldn't seem to get enough air. An anglerfish, my thoughts murmured treacherously. An anglerfish. Shh. The stranger whispered again. Shh, shh. We were silent, staring. It seemed too dark in the shelter, somehow. It was night, but nights were never truly black, even without the full moon that shone fat and pale in the sky. It was darker than it should be. Not enough light coming through the window. I didn't breathe again until the grey light of the moon returned, and the movements outside were gone. Air rushed out of my chest in a long, slow shudder. You picked a bad night to get caught outside. My gaze snapped around to the stranger, whose gaze remained as cool and inscrutable as before. It had dawned on me how odd it was that I had never seen them before. Fataville was not a large town. One couldn't know every single person who lived there, but I was sociable and wandered frequently whenever I could. There was a few people in the town who I was unfamiliar with, but I didn't know their face, their name. At the time, I didn't ask. Something about doing so just seemed wrong. How so? I ventured. They turned their eyes back to the night outside. Bad night, they said again. Lots of folk about. Would have been better to stay indoors. Follow the laws. What do you mean by folk? All I received in return was a disdainful stare. Weren't you taught anything? I was silent, and resolved to ask my parents when morning came, and I could get out of this alive. Carefully, I ventured instead. Why were you out so late? They shrugged. Visiting? There was no elaboration given. I wasn't sure if they were being intentionally opaque, or if they didn't realize more information was usually given, but I let it slide. They were here, and they were helping me. That was the important thing. I couldn't keep precise track of time, but it seemed only a short while before the next attempt came. 3 sharp knocks on the door, and then the voice, masculine and professional. Are you folks all right in there? I jumped. Hearing another person's voice seemed strange, somehow. We'd left the real world for the realm of confusion and shadow, and hearing a police officer seemed so normal it felt incongruous. Yes, officer, we're all right, I called. Next to me, the stranger tensed up, their wide, dark eyes focused on the door. Don't open the door, they whispered. Their voice was soft, but I could hear them clearly. I startled. What? It's a cop. And then I remembered the anglerfish. The knocks came again. Do you mind if I come in? Take a look. It sounded so normal, was the worst part. It didn't have the distortion the scream had. It sounded like a man's voice, tired and waiting to get off his beat and go home. But I knew the police officers in Fataville. My father was one, and I'd met most of his colleagues. I did not know this voice. More knocking. I stayed silent, staring at the door. "Hello?" The police officer's voice was frustrated now. "Open this door." The stranger and I said nothing. A snarl. A low, furious snarl. Knocking harder and faster. "That could have you folks arrested. Open this door." After another minute or so of silent waiting, whatever was outside hissed. It wasn't like a person hissing, nor really like the sound of a snake. More than anything else, it seemed like the sound of wind rustling through dry grass. The footsteps, then walking away. Is that the same thing as before? The stranger shrugged. We didn't speak. I couldn't bring myself to find words to say, only to sit on the cot and stare tense at the thin door. The windows that could probably be shattered with a blow. Small talk was for the real world, the sunlit world, the world that I understood. Somehow, I found it in myself to be bored, even in my terror. One can get used to even fear, if you feel it for long enough. The only other thing besides us in the shelter was a tiny shelving unit, shoved into the corner. It had nothing on it except a container of salt that I found to be mostly empty and a tiny book. I didn't remember the contents, only that it was one of those dime store novels. I hefted the container of salt, considering it seemed appropriate somehow. I remembered something my mother told me. Salt, she said, was important. "Keep that." I jumped, glancing at the stranger. They were still staring out the window into the alien night. They glanced over at me, eyeing the salt container with a look of dubiousness, before turning their gaze back to the window. "We might need it." "We might?" "Just keep it," they repeated. "Just in case." I asked in case of what, but they were not forthcoming. I set it back down and opened the little novel. The pages were ragged, the spine broken, but it was still readable. I had finished about a fourth of it when there was a great crash, as something landed on the roof. I swore and dropped the book, jumping to my feet. The stranger pushed me back down. "Just wait," they said, but their dark, dark eyes even wider than before with fear. I sat back down, shaking, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Heavy footfalls echoed through the tiny room as something moved about on the top of the shelter. I heard scratching, as if from great claws. The world seemed to hold its breath, before with a sound like a great rush of air, whatever had landed on the shelter seemed to disappear. "I'm never going out at night again," I said weakly. The stranger did not smile, but they made a sound that could have been a laugh if you squinted. We waited in the dark for a while. I heard the same scream as before, farther off, and hoped that everyone knew to stay inside no matter what. Sometime after that, there were bells like those on a bridle and the sound of many horses riding together. At that, the stranger seemed to freeze too, holding their breath until the riders, if that is what indeed they were, had disappeared back into the night. Many times I thought I saw a pale face looking in, pressed up against the glass, but when I looked at the window, there was only shadow and darkness. I had almost finished my book when I heard running footsteps. I didn't look up, the image of the anglerfish in the back of my mind. Whatever this was a trick. I knew. No matter what, I would not open the door. That resolution died as soon as whatever it was reached the door, pounding on it with desperate hands. "Gregory!" I nearly shrieked, shooting to my feet. "Mum?" The stranger stepped in front of the door, heedless of my mother's shouts. "Don't open it." Their voice was low and cold. I cast a desperate glance towards the window. It was a trick. It was a trick. It was the anglerfish again. I couldn't. I knew that I couldn't. I just... "Gregory, please," my mother sobbed. "Please, please let me in. I need... Please." I stepped forward. The stranger tensed, but I wasn't going for the doorknob. "Why are you outside this late, Mum?" I called. My mother paused in her weeping, apparently shocked. "Gregory, why would you ask me that?" I bit my lip. There is no guilt in the world worse than a child betraying a parent. "Why were you out so late?" I was looking for you." She sucked in a breath, trying to steady herself. "You were gone, and I was so worried. Your father, Jonathan, and I froze. "My mother," I said with a bite in my voice, "has never called my father anything other than Joe her whole life." There was a red fury rising in my chest. It did not overtake the terror, but mingled with it, mixed with it, creating a potent boiling stew. How dare this thing, whatever it was, take my mother's face? "Try harder than that," I called, sitting back down on the bed. The lure had almost gotten me, but I would avoid the teeth this time. "I won't open the door." It didn't snarl like the cop had. "Gregory?" The thing was not my mother, sounded confused. I heard the door shake as it pounded on it. "Gregory, please, it's me." I bit my lip and said nothing. I would not. I would not. There was a sound like a snarl, and the thing that could not be my mother let out a shrill wail and pounded even harder. "No, no, Gregory, please, please let me in, please." "Don't do it," the stranger said. Their eyes were on me, hard and dark. "You'll kill us both." I was frozen. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. I covered my ears with my hands, closed my eyes and curled up into a ball. I could still hear the screaming, the begging, the desperate pounding on the door. I could still hear it. It seemed like I could never stop hearing it. There was another snarl, and then a desperate rising shriek. I had my hands over my ears, but I heard a wet, meaty sound, like a knife slicing through chicken. I sobbed. But then, silence. Slowly, I uncovered my ears. Something ran its claws down the door. It felt like my heart would stop in my chest. A voice came. It was not my mother's voice. It was her voice, but it was not her. She could never sound like that. It said, "We'll find another way in." The stranger spoke. I didn't understand the words, but the language felt eerie. Something about it put me in a mind of dark pathways through green trees. Evidently, whatever was outside understood better than I. It snarled, still using a replica of my mother's voice. It hit the door once, a blow that made the walls shake but didn't break it, before I heard its footsteps receding into the night. There was nothing else until morning. I didn't move until the stranger did, following them, meek as a mouse as they unlocked the door and stepped outside. The dawn was as welcome as a lifeboat to a drowning man. After so long in the dark, the sight of the normal street in the grey early morning light seemed unreal. I fell to my knees, pressing my hands into the pavement, just to feel the solidity of it, the realness. When I looked up, I saw the stranger walking away. "Hey!" They jumped, turning around as I caught up with them. They looked different in the sunlight. Their eyes seemed less wide and dark, their skin less pale. They could have been any person on the street. "Let me walk you home," I said. "Make sure you get home safely. It's the least I could do after you—" I fell silent. What would have happened to me if I had been alone and opened the door, or even worse, left the safety of the shelter? I found that my mind skittered away from the possibilities. All that mattered, I told myself, was that I'd avoided the anglerfish's jaws. The stranger regarded me for a moment, before nodding. "A favor for a favor. This is correct." They did not say thank you, only turned back down the street and continued walking. We walked in silence. Around us, Fataville continued to wake up. Lights switching on in businesses, people out with their dogs. It all seemed so normal. I shuddered whenever we passed a shelter. It didn't seem like it could be real, but I couldn't find it in myself to convince myself that I had been dreaming. I had heard the scream, the footsteps, seen the shadows. I had heard something pretending to be my mother, pretend to be murdered, while I did nothing. Tears pricked at my eyes. I bowed my head. I couldn't believe that I had done that. I had reason. I had known it wasn't her, but it didn't stop me feeling like a coward. "You're not a coward." I startled. "What?" The stranger's voice was different in the daylight, still cool and blunt, but a little warmer, a little more normal. They looked at me. I couldn't tell what it was they were thinking. Their eyes were as inscrutable as a reptile's. "You acted to protect your own life. That was the correct choice. Don't be stupid and convince yourself otherwise." Slowly, I nodded. I didn't know why. It was hardly advice, but I began to feel better. We continued to walk. I saw a woman coming out of another shelter and waved. I wondered how the rest of the town had fared that night. Hopefully no one else had opened the door. No one else had let the darkness in. I wondered if I would find out about it if they had. The stranger came to a stop. "This is me." I paused, blinking. I'd been expecting a house, obviously, or one of the rare apartment complexes. This was a park. It was different than the one I'd been wandering last night, with less flowers and more trees. I couldn't see in between the trunks, only grey-greenish shadow. I shied away. After this, I wouldn't judge anyone who was scared of the dark. It seemed preeminently reasonable. "Here?" They nodded and looked at me. "Be more careful next time." I nodded. They didn't need to tell me twice, but they weren't done talking. "This is a good place, but there are laws. If we want to keep it that way, we all have to follow them." They reached forward and poked me in the chest. They were still strong, and I stumbled back. They'd been standing in front of me when I looked down at their hand for only a moment. They had been standing in front of me when I started to raise my head, their shoes clearly in my field of vision. They were not standing in front of me when I raised my head all the way, staring at an empty street. Slowly, I turned to look at the woods. The dark green woods. The night caught underneath the canopy. I bowed to the woods, short and respectful, and then turned towards home.